of Trust Framework, and will be moderated by Mr. Bill Voss from ICAO. Mr. Bill Voss has worked in aviation for over 45 years. He is licensed as an airline transport pilot, mechanic, and air traffic controller. He served as a senior executive at the US Federal Aviation Administration, as ICAO Director, Air Navigation Bureau, and as the President CEO of the Flight Safety Foundation. He is now a special advisor to the Director of the Air Navigation Bureau. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bill Voss and his panel.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. You know, the older you get, sometimes these introductions get a little frightening. 45 years, well, all right. So I guess it's just 1 year at a time. All right, so we have a really interesting afternoon ahead of us here. We're going to be tying together a lot of key issues. But before I get into all the content, let me introduce my panel members. Starting over to the left, we have Rob Seegers, who is the next-gen security architect for the FAA. Then we have Mildred Trigler, and she is the Director of Global Airspace Integration for Boeing Next, and she is here today in her capacity for ICC-AIA, which is the trade association representing global manufacturing. Okay. We have Ronaldo Negron, who is here in his capacity of co-president of GUTMA, and also you might know him from Wing. And then we have Christian Strew, the head of European Public Policy for DJI. All right, so now let's talk about where we're going to try to go today. So over dinner last night, we had a long heart-to-heart discussion, and we opted for a process of total transparency. So we're just going to tell you where we're going to try to take you, and you can then decide whether or not we got you there. The idea of having a digital identity is foundational. There's no way to get around it in a digital world. And identity's been a big deal for a long time. We feel that a digital identity is something that you need to have in the aviation ecosystem, and the digital identity should carry the same force of law as a traditional physical identity, like the number painted on the side of the aircraft. And so we're going to see if we can get you there and tell you why that's important. Did I do that all right? Is kind of what we said? All right? We didn't have much to drink. It was a short evening, but a lot of tough discussions. So now let me apologize for the few of you in the audience who have heard probably more than once or twice about this trust framework effort. I've been communicating this on and off for about the last 1.5 to 2 years. And last time we talked about this was in Chengdu. Don't know how many of you were at Chengdu, but I expect there's quite a few that were not. And so I'll try to give a bit of a baseline. We'll take our time. So I'm going to talk a little bit more than a moderator should in order to get everyone level set on what we're trying to do. And also trying together some of the underlying concepts that are so important to this. And also let you know that progress is being made, substantial progress. So let's go back several years ago as ICAO started pondering whether or not it needed to get into this little corner of the world. And as we started looking around the world and seeing what the needs were. Let me see. And we have a remote. Reboot. If I point that way, or you did it for me. All right, I'll just signal you. I can go old school. As you hear, I'm really old. All right. So one of the things we looked at the aviation world is that passenger and freight growth, expansion. We know what's going on. You've seen all those slides. I'll spare you those. They're very pretty, but there's going to be a lot more going on in 2040 than there is today. That means we have to worry about capacity and efficiency demands. A lot of you are not in the conventional side of the aviation business, but if you were or you dabble in it, you can read our global aviation plans from ICAO, the GAMP, and you will see that there is a real concern about trying to pull more capacity and efficiency demands out of the existing system. And fundamentally underpinning that is an aggressive approach towards connectivity. Lots of information flowing between lots of places to be optimized. Not a new idea, but a really fundamental idea that's going to be applied to aviation going forward, and you're going to hear more about how we're looking at doing that in SWIM, the next panel. Okay, so great. We knew we needed to do a lot of connectivity, and then we are going back and say, wow, take a look what's happening in the system. Get away from this ivory palace we live in and look at the real world of aviation, and we're seeing a spectacular digital transformation of the system. There are more comm links going to and from an airplane right now than most people even can conceive of. Engines being managed, powered by the hour by a manufacturer in one part of the world. Data links going to the front of the airplane, the back of the airplane. Maintenance information, connection through MROs, connection back through manufacturers themselves, pushing out software changes and so on, software parts. All of the things, the data that flows in and out just to an airplane is extraordinary. Then you throw on top of the rest of the ecosystem, ATM, airports, increasingly connected, airline ops centers, and all the places they connect to. There's a huge digital transformation going on because there is an economic imperative. And so that's a big deal. Sounds good. We'll tell you why that could be hard, though. We have you folks. We keep calling you new entrants. I wish we could find something cooler. But all of you who are born digital, we're trying to take the other system digital, you're born digital. And so we've got to make the two things work together. And then we realize as we progress this, there's no way you can't do this without changing basically your threat surface. And there you go. I'll go analog. So one of the challenges we saw years ago is we're looking at this and going, wow, all of this cool data exchange is great, but everybody has to do identity and trust. And so if you're a vendor providing a service into an airplane, you're now in the trust business. You're going to have to figure out how you secure that connection. And you do that again and again and again. If you are communicating between the airline and the airplane, or, as I talked about, MRO, manufacturers, parts, etc., everybody has the challenge that even if that wasn't their core business, it's part of their business now to figure out, how do I have a trusted identity on both ends of my communication channel? It's just fundamental networking and security. And so what you get is an awful lot of people doing point solutions because they have to. We also have the problem, we hear more from Rob about this, is we start looking at this prospect of connecting all these systems around the world and passing more data across FIR boundaries and ATM. Wow, it gets a lot harder because all the old isolated comm links we have are being discontinued. And so, well, gee, now we're going to have to do identity and trust point to point with VPNs, which is cool, except, okay, you want to talk from Miami to Nassau? Great. Well, now we got NOTAMs covered. Well, what about weather? Like, oh, now we need to move traffic information. Now we need to move flight plan information. Next thing you know, we've got link after link after link after link. And then we need to decide, well, maybe Nassau needs to talk to Bermuda. And then they got to go link after link after link. So you have a problem that we have a mandate to connect the world in an efficient way and exchange information in a system that without a common sense of identity can't scale to do it. And so all a big deal. And also we go back, and you guys just heard all the great news from the comm folks, right? Don't even think about ADSB, right? And you guys have needs too. And so the idea that you're going to have to find a way where we can do identity and trust, so you can find a way to move things like location information so we can do UTM and surveillance. All that plays together. And so here we are about 3 years ago going like, I guess we're a little late getting into the game, is what we decided, because what we really have here is radical divergence and duplication, and that's something we maybe should have gotten on top of. So we're playing a little catch up, but we're moving faster than normal. Please. Okay, so how do you go from divergence to convergence? You go back and find if you see if all the pieces of the community have a shared problem. And the shared problem is a fairly simple one, that those of you who are in the networking, you have to establish identity and maintain trusted relationships in as efficient as way possible, and everybody in the ecosystem shares the same problem. And maybe if we did this well enough, with a robust enough, a trusted identity for a piece of the system, like an airplane, maybe 20 companies trying to connect to the airplane could trust that identity as opposed to trying to create their own. And that's a really big idea. And that's a tall order for ICAO to fill, but that's something I think we are somewhat suited to do. Next, please. So the idea is, you know, as we talked about this program, it wasn't about solving everything in the world. It was just, we'll call it a victory when people start converging again. And so we need to talk about how to do this coordination and cooperation across the ecosystem in ways that everybody can reuse. Find ways where you have needs that unites this community that's so diverse. Build on existing foundations and talk about how we do it in a way that we actually have one interoperable system. There's going to be times you need to be special, but we need to talk about, that needs to be a conscious decision, not one that's forced upon you. We shouldn't force you to come up with workarounds that make you distinct. We ought to offer you a path where you can actually have a common ground and diverge where you need to. Next, please. So there's good news in some of this. And this is something where I got to point back to what you heard from David about registration stuff. ICAO's been doing identity and trust in a big way since 1944. It just hasn't been digital. It has to do it. The reason it's so important to ICAO, 2-second lecture on law, or 30-second lecture, you have a problem where ICAO has to associate aircrafts. They have to have a clear identity for an aircraft or a piece of the system, and they actually have to assign a nationality to it, which I always thought seemed really ridiculous. These are metal. Why do they have to have a nationality? And it's because when you register an aircraft to a state, you determine what laws apply to that aircraft operations and where, which is a really big deal. Stuff like, oh, what rules do I have to follow from my home country when I'm operating in a foreign country? Which ones are which? If I make a mistake and do something wrong in the foreign country, how does that foreign country respond? Well-worn processes, still being matured after 75 years, but well-worn. If you have an incident or an accident, how's it investigated? Who's responsible to do what? Do you get to show up? Do you get a seat at the table? How's it balanced against the local law? All that stuff's all sorted up, and that's really what's at the core of ICAO. So ICAO is actually really good at this question of identity and trust. It really is a trust framework, but it's been all analog. We put out standards by which states issue certificates that are then recognized by other states, and we basically anchor the trust in each other's trust of the sovereign state. And it's applied consistently across the system, please. And so we work in a system that we don't think we have to abandon right away. Because if you're trying to get a trusted digital identification to unlock all the wonders of communications in the modern age, you could go get a certificate from GoDaddy, or you could maybe make sure the regulator who gave you your registration certificate or pilot certificate or airline operating certificate vouches for you, because then it's pretty hard to hack. It's the ultimate two-factor authentication. You've got thousands, tens of thousands of regulators going to work all around the world, issuing certificates, interacting with various people who are part of the system. And if those regulators say, yes, I'm the principal ops inspector for airline X, and I will tell you that I just imported that aircraft, so it is absolutely legitimate aircraft, it is who they say it is. This airline is who they say they are. And so you start getting something that's a lot more robust than a return email from a certificate authority, which is how you get something that you would secure to do commerce. And so there's something we might have to offer as ICAO. Next. Look at all the stuff we already do. If all you do is, if you license an aerodrome, boom, okay, maybe that's a good justification that aerodrome should have a certificate, et cetera. You could go down through the list. And so we've already got a lot of work going on and a lot of trust that is anchored in human interaction, which makes it incredibly difficult to fake. Next, please. So the trust framework that ICAO is doing, I guess you won't be shocked that we're not exactly doing really cutting edge stuff here, because that's not what ICAO does well. We're trying to cut back on doing cutting edge stuff. You know, maybe research and engineering isn't our best thing. I think we can all recall some oopses there. So we're doing something that's very simple. And it isn't the end of the road, but identity is usually captured under a PKI scheme. And you can layer other stuff like blockchain, OAuth, et cetera, on top of it, but it's a place to do identity. And it's really easy. It mimics almost exactly what ICAO's been doing for decades anyway. Only a paper certificate happens to be a digital certificate, and a lot of the mechanisms underneath it apply. So it's a fairly simple idea. Now, do you ever want ICAO to get in the digital business of moving stuff around? Do you want us writing software? Do you want us being the only source of identity that if we fail, the system shuts down? No, ICAO doesn't either. But we can at least provide the trust, the authenticity, the credibility, the processes underneath this. And we can use other mechanisms such as commercial certificate authorities for the mechanics. And all this is a type of thing we're trying to do. But there are things you need in order to make identity work in our world. Next slide, please. So we talk about a trust bridge as part of this trust framework. There's other types of trust bridges in the world in big corporations, but you know, for us, the reason we got to talk about trust bridge is that our servers fly around at 600 miles an hour all over the world, which makes for an interesting set of challenges. Makes us a little bit special. We're trying not to be very special, but we're a little special. And so there's a need for identity to be validated as stuff goes around the world. And in old legacy aviation, I actually overstated this. It wasn't done with fax machines. It's actually done by the fact that they make you carry the certificate on the airplane in an envelope. And an inspector knocks on the door of the airplane and says, "May I see your certificates, please?" That's how trust is communicated in the current system. We can do better than that in a digital system. In a digital world, we can exchange trust or credentials in real time. And actually, you're going to see a demonstration when we get to Drone ID at the end of the day tomorrow, where you're going to see digital certificates flowing through a regulator, pushing themselves out to vehicles and being bridged in real time, in seconds. And so we can do that type of transformation. To do that, you heard earlier that, you know, we're realizing, boy, we're really going to have to start interconnecting and interoperating some registries. And so that's going to be something that we all have to figure out how to do in an efficient way, acknowledging that an awful lot of people have registries already. And so we got to talk about how to align and connect, not reinvent. We're cutting back on reinvention here as well, please. So that's all cool about identity. Identity is a really, really important thing. I'm not an engineer, but I think I've had that beaten into me. There's also things that ICAO can do that maybe others can't do as well, that could help the situation as we transform digitally. And so a trusted digital identity is very cool, but if that's all you have and we're going to throw the whole world onto the public internet, that still looks a little risky, at least for us risk-adverse folks in aviation, right? So maybe we have to start talking about some level of isolation, some special things we can do that make the risk a little lower. Next, please. So what are we trying to do? In the International Aviation Trust Framework Group, there's a subgroup of it, which, by the way, is populated by a lot of really great people from industry. We're bringing in all sorts of folks, you know, Qualcomm, Intel, people you would not normally see at these meetings, Internet Engineering Task Force, ICAO. And they are talking about this idea of a aviation interoperable network where we basically federate networks that are already being put in place globally on a regional basis that take advantage of IP infrastructure, but we provide some level of logical isolation. Now, none of this is a done deal, but we're just telling you that this is being looked at from an engineering perspective, and there are pieces of it they have promised. Because ICAO is, we are who we are, where we have all those things that we talked about, all those license certificates, that ecosystem falls under us, we can have a conversation across that ecosystem and say, well, how's about if we figured out how many IPv6 addresses we might need, and we go with one voice to the people that do allocation of these addresses, get ourselves a block of addresses that will serve the needs of aviation today and well into the future, including all of you folks, and go, okay, and then maybe that becomes a private set of addresses that the rest of the world can't freely route to. It's not a really new idea. It's something we've done back in the 90s with the finance world. It's not the end-all to be-all, but hey, you're there. Why wouldn't you? Same thing, we start talking about top-level domains, another trick from the finance community. We are not naive, and we're working with people that know modern networking and security. We know what a zero-trust environment is, and we know you don't solve the world's problems by building a moat around your systems. But this is something that maybe makes a lot easier for everybody that's within the ecosystem. If you're not working your way, doing intrusion detection with 10,000 kitty hackers a day, you at least have a quieter place for aviation to be, that to some level is logically isolated from the public internet, even though in the modern world, you're always going to be sharing infrastructure with the public internet. We think it's something ICAO can do, and ICAO is trying to do that, not to make a buck. We're not a company. We're trying to do it as a service to make it easier for you guys to work in this threat environment. Again, we're not going to try to run a network. We're just going to try to provide governance or procedures that you need to do global interoperability. We're about process, procedures, policies. Okay, please. Now, since Drone Enabled 2, a year ago, there's been an air navigation conference where this whole topic was discussed at great length. And out of that conference, the governing bodies of ICAO says, you know, we're going to let you have a license we've never given anybody ever. We think this is important enough. You stand up a study group and you start working on this, and we're going to give you a complete license to handpick the right type of experts, even if they're outside the conventional aviation industry and they're not normally the people who would show up to ICAO meetings. And we took that latitude and went as far and as fast as we could with it. A bunch of preliminary meetings. The first official meeting happened in May 2019, where we officially broke the effort up into 3 groups. One, which is basically the operational needs, digital identity, and the one working on the questions regarding network isolation and so on. And so those groups have been identified. Next slide, please. And so what's happened since then? Well, you know, I can't say we're as big as an RPAS meeting, but it's growing pretty quickly. We're taking advice on Leslie on how to deal with growth like that. But there's been a lot of face-to-face meetings since May. Some just 2 weeks ago. Virtual meetings, I have to say, are nearly continuous. I've been trying to keep up. I can't. I would be 30 hours a week on the phone just keeping up with the continuous meetings that are occurring. Multiple use cases under development as people start wrapping their heads around, whoa, what does this mean to me in an MRO? What does this mean to me in distribution of secure parts? What does on and on and on. There's working out certificate policies. And We're not starting from scratch. We're taking policies that some regional networks are already have in place and adapting them and harmonizing them. Some of that's going to be done like this spring. The network policies are under development, and we're talking about governance, addressing, naming. We're working with the existing communication panels, working with Vaughn, who you heard from earlier. And rather than just try to do this as a dream in the sky, we're actually working up plans where once we have the policies we think are right, we apply those policies in the real world, in real operations. Maybe Rob can tell more about what we're thinking, where we can actually make sure these things work in a real world to set up connectivity. We're getting great industry and government support, and we're getting more all the time because people are showing up and thinking this thing might have some legs. Thanks. So what's going to happen from here? Going to keep up the pace as best as we can. Next full working group in February. Even colder than now, if you can believe it. States industry keep adding up. The technical requirements are going to be matured. And as they get matured, we aren't going to try to do something in isolation of the rest of the structure of ICAO. They're going to get passed back to the panels that need to deal with the changes. A lot of the work is going to be focusing on harmonizing standards and policies that already exist in regions around the world so they can be applied globally. So that we don't have 1,000 relationships, one-of policies, documenting the trust we place in each and every link. Proof of concept being planned between Eurocontrol and the FAA. So we're going to get some of these policies harmonized, and then we're going to try them out because they need to be done. They have operational needs. Hopefully, we're going to try to get this intense effort wrapped up within about 2 years and then transition the pieces of it out to standing committees. We're not here building an empire. We're not trading. Something's going to be standing. We're here to tackle the problem, scope it out, and then transition to the appropriate governance mechanisms in the organization. So that is where we're at with the trust framework. And so now let me work through this a little bit to talk about how relevant this is all to us. It's really important, I think, at this juncture to go back and see where we can find convergence, where we can find economies by recognizing there are common needs and common ways to approach those needs. So let's go back, and if you'll bear with me for a minute, let's go back to the old aviation world. And without calling you old, Rob, we'll go you first, because there's nothing more traditional in this building than talking about how ANSPs communicate with one another. And Rob will tell you about how this applies to that, and maybe about how it could apply some other places, and then we'll work our way down the list. Please, Rob.
So thank you for indulging me here to talk about what I would call what are the drivers for change for the FAA. Because today in one of the bigger ANSPs in the world, we have hundreds of connections with existing aviation ecosystem organizations and users. And what we see today is that the connectivity that exists, that was built up over time, is changing for two reasons. First of all, the telecommunication service industry is changing, where you basically shortly won't be able to get dedicated telecommunication services as they existed before available anymore. You know, you all know about X25 links, serial links. You know, we all think that when we're at home and we use the internet and you use your iPhone to get online, that's how traditional aviation works, while in reality, throughout the aviation ecosystem, there is still very many legacy connectivity in operation today. That legacy communication in very short time will be deprecated and not available anymore. And those links will have to move towards an IP-based network, as that's where the service providers in the world are standardizing on. So that's one of the drivers for change. The second driver of change that Bill has already touched on is really the fact that when you are moving towards a world of a higher capacity need, and you need to be able to handle more operations, and you still don't have more concrete, and you don't have more airspace, and you have to increase efficiency. And in order to increase efficiency, you have to go to more automation, which will then drive more just-in-time information, which means a higher connectivity and more information being able to flow from all the aviation ecosystems to the ANSP, and in this case, the FAA. And combined with that, if you want that type of connectivity, you really can't afford the cost of fit-for-purpose networks and longer-term the use of protected spectrum, which is always a very interesting, controversial point. But when you go with the open standards and you're going with licensed spectrum, and in some cases even unprotected spectrum, you will need to get better protection. Because today, a lot of our protections comes from the fact that we know exactly what's between these two dedicated telecommunication services, what's the beginning point and the end point. And we have actually contracts or information security agreements between the two entities that are actually communicating with each other. Well, when you go to an ubiquitous network, that is not necessarily the case anymore, or it would not be sustainable with the number of entrants that we have. Next slide. So when you look at it on the left-hand side, you basically see what I call the ball of yarn. So this is what we have today. We basically have hundreds of communication connections that are all fit for purpose and very specific. And we know exactly who's on the other side of the line. And as long as we know that that physical connectivity hasn't been breached, we can trust the information that flows through it. Now, when you get to a ubiquitous IP network that is interconnecting way more organizations, and you have a much more transparent information flow, you have to be able to associate the origin of the information to digitally to the actual physical originator of the information. Also, when you go to use IP networks, you get, I would call it, the advantage of the internet and the curse of the internet. Because as we all know, with using open source software, open source hardware, and the internet protocols, there's a lot of I would call adversaries that have developed a lot of know-how to attack this. And so you need that additional protection so that you can actually protect the aviation system against the hacker community, I would say. So that's a challenge for the aviation system without a trust framework. So next slide. So one of the key issues around using a ubiquitous network that you all may have heard about is the man-in-the-middle attack. You know, example, someone gets a DNS address from a internet DNS provider. They get a certificate from a web trust provider, and the only thing they have to prove to them is that they have a valid DNS address and they have a valid email address, and you all know how easy those are to get. Well, then they set up shop, they start spoofing an IP address, they get onto the overall network, and now they basically start redirecting traffic that is legitimate to themselves and are basically interfering with the communication. That's sort of I would call it the biggest nightmarish threat of using ubiquitous IP networks. So we want to protect ourselves from this. Next slide. So what does it mean actually to protect yourself from that? So you really need to attribute the origin of the information. And attribution has always been extremely important in the ICAO classic trust framework, because the way we protect ourselves in aviation from a kinetic attack is basically by knowing that you can attribute it to the attacker, and basically they don't want to take the system down because they take themselves down. And the same principles can be applied in the digital world as long as you can digitally attribute the information of coming from a specific origin. And so what do you need for that? A digital identity. So common IETF trust framework agreement basically helps you with eliminating all the bilateral agreements that existed in the past with individual connectivity, and that you would have to continue to sustain in a ubiquitous IP network if you don't have a trust framework. The other part is a common identity policies, the certificate policy that Bill mentioned, and how do you know that you can trust someone to use that certificate policy? Well, you need an auditing framework under which you can ensure that everyone plays by the same rules. And then once you get the information flow between IETF participants, you can basically attribute it to the source by digitally signing the information. And the 4 o'clock presentation tomorrow actually will show some of that technology in action in relationship to the remote ID on drones. So, and then lastly, you basically need a network trust. And what does it mean to have network trust? To Bill's point earlier, you need trusted network addressing. So you need to be within an address range that you know that you can expect from each other. Trusted domain naming services, and trusted network operations, which basically means each participant would have an information security management system and apply the appropriate controls so that they know that they are not going to be able to attack each other. Next slide. So how does this actually, or how could this be applied to an ATM-UTM integration? So when you look at the overall ecosystem today of aviation, where I said we already have hundreds connections. Now take tomorrow the UTM system, where basically in the United States, instead of having one ANSP, you basically get a multitude of ANSPs, where basically a UTM USS basically plays the role as an ANSP. Then you get a multitude of operators that are put on top of it, many more potentially than we have today's airlines. And then you get, instead of thousands of aircraft, you get millions of drones. So when you scale that up, you have to realize that the communication that happens in that ecosystem together with traditional aviation really could benefit from similar approaches that we are thinking about to apply to traditional aviation. And so I'm not going to bore you with all the details. This is a concept diagram, and this is not set in stone, but from an idea perspective, this is where we are thinking we could try to find common ground and use some of the principles that we've been developing around the trust framework in the UTM integration. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob. Starting to pull some of the ideas together. So you see the conventional aviation world is really trying to adapt itself so that we can find a common way to operate. And you're starting to hear, I think, a pattern that a digital ID is a big part of that. Now, in between, I would say, Mildred, the traditional world and the new world is where you live. And so, please, would you have a few remarks on how you see this trust framework applying? I'll hide over here. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. So ICC-AIA is actually actively involved in the discussion and also contributes to the working groups related to the aviation trust framework, because we really believe that this is an important initiative The aviation system is becoming increasingly global, digital, and interconnected in nature. And we see that the efforts are often independent and not very well coordinated. So this leads to unnecessary inefficiencies, added costs, security vulnerabilities, but most importantly, it does not allow us to leverage the full value of digital transformation. A central pillar of the future ecosystem is actually trust. The backbone of this digitally connected aviation system is the seamless exchange of data and information, which is essential to delivering the high level of safety, security, and efficiency that aviation demands. Establishing this trust framework is really foundational to realize the aviation ecosystem. And this is why ICCAIA is actively involved, but this is also why I call for other industry players to guide the work of the ICAO Trust Framework. So what the ICAO Trust Framework is setting out to achieve is no small undertaking. This initiative aims at developing a common trust model under which a global architecture and common principles for future aviation ecosystem will be developed. And there is a lot we can actually learn from this digital savvy new entrants. Just to give you two examples where an aircraft digital ID can lead to more efficiency in the system. If we take, for example, a digitally filed flight plan that can be sent to a CAA inspector shortly after the takeoff of the airplane, the CAA inspector can digitally reach back to the CAA of the registration via the IATC trust bridge to verify full aircraft and pilot details prior to the aircraft landing. This is one of the use cases where we can show that this leads to more thorough, efficient, and better validated digital ramp checks. Another example are digitally signed TCs or STCs, which can ultimately greatly improve the support to a CAA to make ADs and CBs notification, but at the same time also for the aircraft owner and the operator to more efficiently determine AD and SB applicability. So what do we expect from the IATF model? The IATF model needs to be scalable, it needs to be technology agnostic, and it needs to involve all aviation stakeholders. It should also support the tailoring of trust and assurance level requirements proportionate to the criticality of the data and the information. As we have already heard, this requires the development of a framework of governance, principles, policy procedures, and requirements for digital identification that is compatible with, but also can enable the global trust framework. The problem we are facing here ultimately that this presupposes the existing of a common understanding of what the future ecosystem looks like. And this is a contribution that we as industry can deliver. A consistent picture of future operational concepts and supporting elements that ultimately this global trust framework will support. It's important also to note that we cannot only involve the existing airspace users, but we also need to look into the future. And I'm not only talking about the players in the UAM field, also about supersonic, hypersonic, and at some point suborbital vehicles. UTM is another example where the trust framework can really provide added value. And Ronaldo will elaborate on this a bit later today. But the potential scope of the work needs to be much broader. Our thinking on the boundaries of the aviation system needs to go way beyond the traditional scope of the aircraft and the ATM system. We need to basically explore the trust from a perspective of an entire ecosystem across all phases of the system life cycle. And trust must be assured across the entirely new stakeholders, factoring in the unique nature of data, interaction, and other non-technical needs particular for each of them. A great illustrative example is the development of remote ID. The system of trust needed for remote ID goes far beyond the definition of protocols for secure RF transmission of drone identification information. Trust needs to be established across the system as a whole. And remote ID must also support a wide range of stakeholders, from the public app developer to law enforcement bodies to manufacturers, drone operators, aviation safety regulatory authorities. And this really shows that we need a systematic, consistent, and appropriate means of establishing trust across all of the potential stakeholders' transactions. And that's ultimately the goal of the ICAO Trust Framework. But to further complicate the situation, our understanding of the future ecosystem is rapidly evolving. Almost on a daily basis, we see new vehicle concepts, operational use cases, and enabling technology. And this is another reason why industry needs to be actively involved in order to make sure that we are creating a framework that's performance-based and flexible. But we as industry also need to support ICAO through helping to define specific use cases. And last but not least, another important area is that this work touches upon many of the ICAO working groups and panels. And it's essential that we coordinate well and that we jointly identify where the low-hanging fruits, where the near-term opportunities to support the amendment or the development of standards and recommended practice and guidance material, to ultimately make the vision of an integrated aviation trust framework a reality. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mildred. Now, Ronaldo, I'll give you the option. You can either use the handheld or come on up here.
I'll come on up to keep the trend going.
All right, keep the trend going. And so now we can talk about how this applies in UTM. Thanks.
But all my notes are on a phone because I thought a digital panel, I should have a digital reader. But I won't be as long as comprehensive, but those were really excellent comments, and I think we can echo it. A little bit about GUTMA for folks who aren't familiar with it. GUTMA is the Global UTM Association. So yes, we made an acronym of an acronym. But we do represent over 75 members who range from CAAs and regulators to ANSPs to what we're trying to get away from, I guess, new entrants, but you can think about people who want to be or are UAS service suppliers, drone manufacturers, even standards bodies, and telcos. So really the whole ecosystem that goes around the UTM that we imagine today, and we're really excited for that broad set of providers. And as part of that, we really focused on digital, right? For us, the concept of a digital identity is, to be honest, a no-brainer. It's something that we expect in the work that we do. It's something that is core to UTM today. Whenever you join a UTM provider, you actually establish a digital identity, but it's not interoperable, right, as part of it. And so we recognize, and it's definitely not globally harmonized. And so for us, as a global organization and looking how we help scale UTM across the board, having a harmonized and interoperable framework is critical for that. As part of that, support for duplication, digitalization, and deduplication, we really want to get to the crux of it. How do we get interoperable APIs? How do we have a set of standards that we can work together to achieve that level of interoperability? Especially because we recognize that drones cross borders. Right? If you talk to any CAA, one of their challenges are people who come in and one don't know the rules or where they're gonna of that country, but also need to re-register, be part of it. And that's another key challenge of interoperability that we see today. We also recognize the challenge that it's gonna be millions of drones, right? Most CAAs have registered several thousand, 100,000, but who has registered in the millions of aircraft? And that's a whole new change that's going to happen as well. And so one of the things we want to do to work together with that, and based on some of our initial research and development of interoperability, is GUTMA wanted to propose a registration interoperability working group that would pull together ICAO, the CAAs, industry, as well as telcos and other players together in a room to go work through how we can go ahead and tackle some of these tough challenges. I think it is something that industry has to play a role in. I think it's something that we can help. I think it's an area that UTM itself, as a fundamentally digitized system, can prove some of the initial concepts out as part of it too, and bring that expertise to the table from a wide range of industry that's provided there. But the key thing that we're looking at as we go forward with that, and hopefully working together on that working group, is really realizing that now is the moment for registration, right? There are many countries who are implementing their systems today. We don't want any rework on that, but we also want to make sure that UTM and drone operators can have seamless, fast, and ideally low-cost access to that registration, that it can be done in an accurate way and integrated well into the operations of hobbyists as well as commercial operators who are flying today. And so to do that now is definitely the right time, probably even a little bit past the right time to start having some discussions about how we can work together on that. But look forward to your questions, and if you have any questions about GUTMA as well, there's many board members here, including Christian, who can come ahead and if you have questions, we'd love to talk to you more about GUTMA as a whole as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Ronaldo, and thank you for that generous outreach. I mean, ICAO is really trying to do the things that ICAO can do and needs to be done, and trying to bring in other partners to help on things like APIs, interoperability, and so on, which is not something that you normally work out here. And so thank you for answering our call earlier today. Christian, Mayor, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. So I won't spend a whole lot of time introducing DJI because I assume a lot of you know who DJI is and what we do. But I think it's pretty evident that coming on the back of this discussion, we are born digital, and you can say we are the new kid on the block in the aviation industry. To me, there is a very big connection between the issues being discussed on this panel and the previous panel where we heard about the CTA drone serial number standard and the aircraft registration network. And you can say these are really good example of why we need the trust framework. Tie it together with what we're going to hear tomorrow about remote ID and the points that Ronaldo just made about why registration is so important right now. These are all core components of the trust framework. And I think the essence we can take from all of this is that if we can pull all of this from the national level into ICAO and have some sort of common approach to how we handle the issues of registering drones and how we ensure that states have access to information about drones themselves and the owners and operators, even though they're being operated in different countries. That's a core element. So you can say from a DJI point of view, we clearly support registration as part of the trust framework because it will promote the feeling of responsibility among drone owners. It will provide an easy access to education, as well as it will facilitate enforcement. And that's a key component of the trust framework, right? Because we had the example of drone operators using their drones outside their country of origin or the country of registration. So today they essentially have two choices. Either they register in each country they are operating in, because that's the way the current drone registration schemes work, or they only register in their home country and break the law in other countries they're operating in. Something like the trust framework should be able to facilitate this creation of a true market of international drone operations for both hobbyists and professional drone operators. So as with many other things, you can say the detail is always in the fine print, and that's something that we're going to invest in the future as we go forward with the trust framework, because the trust framework, we've heard, will cover everything from manned aviation to air traffic control, air traffic management, to all constituents in aviation down to drones. And that, to me, really tells me that it's not one size fits all, because it's going to have to be proportional to what the risk is and what the cost is involved with the different components going forward in this. And it's pretty clear and apparent to the most of the people in the room that there are different risks associated with different kind of aircraft operations and different kind of components in aviation. Just let me check where we are here. And you can say, so the risk-based proportionality is really a key element in the trust framework. We've seen the concepts that Rob mentioned about certificates. That could be one approach. There are other approaches to how you clearly authenticate an identity and how you ensure who is who in this system. And it's all going to have to be tied together, even if we're talking about UTM or if we're talking about drone operations outside UTM. And I'll end on that and look forward to your questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and I am monitoring for questions, by the way. I've got the iPad, I promise. Okay, and let me just go ahead and enlarge it a little bit. I mean, we hit registration really, really hard, and for good reason. And we said this before, but let me make sure you hear it again in this context. A lot of things change when you follow the registration rules that have been laid out in international law. Where right now you have to register everywhere you go. But if we could get a system where the registration in one country is recognized in another, then you gain the full impact of all the treaties and laws around it. I mean, it's significant because if you have an accident, you'd much rather be investigated under Annex 13 of the Chicago Convention than under a random act being applied by the local police officer at the place you had the accident. That's a really big deal. If someone uses one of your vehicles to launch an attack, well, lo and behold, that's covered under another convention. That convention says it only applies to aircraft registered to a contracting state, not multiple states, because you got to pick one. And so this whole idea of trying, I know you're rightfully a little bit petrified of the old aviation system selling you old stuff, but there's a couple good things you really might want to recycle. As this industry grows, I'm sure it's like liability limits. There's some really cool stuff we have, and it all ties back to registration. And so that's a really, really important idea. I just want to pound on that thing a few more times. So we've said a lot of things here, but we've also, let me just go ahead, though, first to the panel. And I want to ask the question, I think I heard some things about proportionality, some warnings for ICAO of not getting carried away. So could I go around and say, are there things that ICAO shouldn't do? You should warn us away. We're listening. And are some things that ICAO really has to do in the near term to modify the existing framework? Does anybody want to start in that? No? Go ahead. You've got it. Warn us off of something, Rob. You're in the middle of all this.
So once the trust framework comes together in terms of the definition, at some point you'll see an operational component arise that you need to be able to make it actually happen. Because, when you put this type of large endeavor together, you run the risk to end up with a big pile of paper. And that pile of paper never comes to fruition. And ICAO can only go so far in providing the legal framework and the international recognition of ICAO. Once this thing needs to start operating, I believe this will be a combination of industry and states and participants that need to make this happen. And I think that's where the tying it back to ICAO from a legal and international status perspective makes a lot of sense, but from a technical and operational perspective, that's where I think ICAO needs to get out of the way.
Fair enough. Don't do ops, okay? No server in the basement under a leaky pipe, as I said. Okay, any other comments along those lines? Mildred?
Yeah, I think the first comment is don't reinvent the wheel, but this
Yeah.
is probably a comment that people would have expected. But I think more importantly, it's also having realistic expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where you need the help of industry to really pursue this effort in a way that's fit for purpose. And it is up to us to also share this information and to be actively involved to shape it. And then coming back to the comment that was made previously, and then to use the ICAO platform to actually develop more political buy-in for the actual implementation.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I would think the key here is staying performance-based and not prescribing solutions. I think the solutions that we discuss now will be obsolete in 5 years, right? And so we need to be able to make sure that we can rapidly adjust and address that and maintain the flexibility to achieve it. The other thing I would say is really, I think proportional is key when we think about cost. Even getting someone to register a drone for $5, if you change that to 10, that actually changes the amount of people who are compliant and part of the system. And I think in everything that we do, we want to encourage and enable and embrace that level of compliance and people joining that ecosystem. And I think at that level, again, ease and cost are two things that are very, very critical there. But again, fit for purpose. If we have good partnership with industry, I think we can help and bridge that gap as well.
Okay, great.
I'll pick up on the cost issue because I think Ronaldo has a clear point that there is a trade-off between safety and compliance on the one hand and cost on the other. And you can say there is a tipping point where people won't register because it's getting too expensive. It's not something that can be handled at an ICAO level necessarily, but it's something that needs to be thought into the system. That there, especially when you're looking at recreational drone users, you actually want compliance because it's an access to educate them, it's an access to foster responsibility and accountability, but you don't want to overprice it because then you won't get that pickup.
You didn't ask what ICAO can do, and I don't know if that's going to be a question.
Do the can-do thing, yeah.
But it took a dinner with Bill Voss, which was not a short dinner, but a very good dinner.
We didn't drink much, though.
We did not drink much, but we did talk a lot about the value that registration brings.
Yeah.
And I think that is a message that is not clear to new entrants, is not clear to folks who just bought a drone. They don't understand the liability and the benefits you get, liability reduction, actually. And so I think there's an interesting challenge from ICAO of what you can do is really help to explain that. So I think we've invited Bill to be on a, not a podcast, but like a GUTMA webinar to talk about that, to help educate. But how do you take all the annexes that you talked about and the values and benefits of that, and how do you shrink that into something that can be digestible of the value of a registration? Because I think that is something that ICAO can bring and explain really well.
Thank you. And it's something that we should have explained better earlier, I think. It's like one of those things we sort of took for granted, and it's one of those things you're so familiar with when you're a regulator of conventional aviation, you forget it's there because you were raised on it. And so, and I think if we, to recount some of our conversations before, there are some foundational things ICAO needs to probably do, because right now, all of this registration stuff is captured in Annex 7, which is all about paper and paint, actually. Marking, how you paint the mark on the airplane, which alphabet you use, what colors are okay. And there's a point where we need to be able to talk about a digital mark. And that's, I think, something we will follow through, and you'll probably hear again come up tomorrow. Maybe it's time to talk about a digital mark, and if that digital mark confers ID, that ID should have the full force of law that you would get if you mailed in a piece of paper with a stamp. So I think that's something else we're trying to follow through on. And so let's, I promised I would get you there when I started the meeting, so I got questions. Let's go with it, okay? All right. So, first one, I won't divulge the source of the questions, but question to Boeing. Thank you for all panelists. In the case of Boeing, how much further in the following years is going to be connected? Okay, let me see if I get this right. So in the following years, where are you going to be connecting onboard systems to the future aviation cloud, such as flight management system and other digital systems that are very critical in manned commercial aviation? So now I think we're getting into the place where we're starting to cross over into the magic world of safety and certification and technology. So I'm so glad you got that, not me. Yeah, I was, how much further in the following years, so how many years ahead, is going to be connected onboard systems to the future aviation cloud, such as flight management systems and other digital systems that are very critical to manned commercial aviation? So I think it's the outlook as to how many years out before we're actually starting to take those critical systems and connect it to the aviation cloud, is how we took it.
Yeah, so I think what's important here is not the exact numbers of years, but I think more the realization that this is coming sooner than people expect, and that rulemaking takes, and these sort of initiatives takes quite a lot of time. So I think the essence of the answer to the question should be, we need to start right now to prepare for a future that might come tomorrow, and sooner than we expect.
Yeah, we're catching up a bit, aren't we? Okay. Here's one. I think I know where this is going to go. So regarding trust framework implementation, talking about resilience, how do you anticipate to operate if a foundational element of the trust framework, e.g. the PKI, failed or was compromised? I think we've had these conversations. And how do you anticipate to operate surveillance if the PKI fails? I'll take one little addition to that from my world, is that, for one, you build a pretty robust PKI system when you connect it to the regulator side. It makes it harder to take down than, say, a commercial website would normally be. So there's some benefit to that. And there's also, I think, one of the things we realize here is that even if if the airplane comes across your screen as an air traffic controller and it says, I don't recognize that ID, the air traffic controller can do a whole lot of things like they do today. Squawk ident, 2 or 3 questions, and so there's other alternative means in the operation so that you don't necessarily fail hard like you do in a network. And so not like an app going down, you still got people in the app. But I think Rob is probably already trying to respond to this question. He's just itching for it, so go ahead.
So in principle, there's different ways the system can fail. To give you an example, and depending on the scenario, it really depends, right? So say that a digital identity system under the form of an issuing certificate authority basically is breached, physically breached. As part of the trust framework, we do envision a form of identity monitoring, which is really a very modern way to look at identity, where basically, and you may have all noticed that a lot of internet providers today, your bank and your email systems are doing that, where when you are suddenly changing the behavior of where the information is coming from, and you're using that identity, and although the identity is still the same, you're being challenged because a pattern is basically detected that says, although this identity has been authorized and is compliant, it's behaving differently than it used to behave, and you're getting a challenge. That's one way to mitigate this situation. The next mitigation, obviously, is resilience, where you're not relying as an organization on a single issuer, and you basically are using backup identities. And even when you do cross-certification to a bridge or some other mechanism, you can use multiple links, like 2 bridges. And so that when one fails, you still have your backup. So we are actually working on these sort of architectural constructs to think through all these different scenarios so that we can build in the resilience in the system, and that we are actually going by the assumption that we will be breached. Because resilience is about realizing that being hacked is the norm, and therefore you have to have mechanisms, operations, and procedures in place that will actually make you resilient, and so that you can recover faster. And that's really a foundational part of putting a good trust framework together.
Thank you, Rob. And now we're in a great position. We have more questions than time.
I wanted to say,
jump in, please.
Just one thing to that question. That's not a new problem,
no.
Right? And so, in aviation, can leverage what's already been out there from
Exactly.
banking, from e-commerce, from everywhere else. So I was interested by the question because the answer is let's go get the people who've done it in 3 other industries and pull them together and go answer
Exactly.
in that regard. And I think there's a lot of best practices there.
Yep.
And no one talks about when they ask a question like that, what's the risk of not having an identity framework at all, right? And I think that is still a key thing that sits there on top of everything we're doing today.
Yeah, and I've been rather polite by not pointing out how many connections are completely non-secured and how much data is flowing over the non-secured connections today, so we're already open here and there. So let's, a little speed dating here, okay. I've got a question I'll try to get to here, which is basically, I agree that rules need to be proportionate to risk, but when you connect a low-risk drone to a complex network, how do you protect the wider system from that low-risk drone becoming the weak link in network security? Go for it.
Sure, as someone who's connecting a low-risk drone to a eventually complex and comprehensive airspace as a UAS service supplier, I think there is one incumbent responsibility on that provider to be able to maintain that level of security. But honestly, we're going to expect some additional identity work for you to be part of our system.
Yep.
Right? Wing is a sister company of Google and is under Alphabet, and we will manage leveraging those same level of identity best practices and security that we're required to follow, even if you didn't tell us to. And so I think it's really something that each USS is going to have their own standard for identity as well, and it's going to have to plug into this framework. In addition, we get to provide that layer of defense and potentially that layer of separation between the low-risk drones and the overall system itself. So you have a little bit of a buffer, which is always good as you have different layers and defense and depth as part of that process. And so I do think there's several ways, both again, the additional layers that the USSs will provide, in part because that's their business, but also because there'll be that additional layer and buffer as part of that process.
Got it. And I'll just add one quick comment there before we move on to the next one, is that keep in mind too that we're not going to do, we're talking about a trust framework and identity, logical isolation. Someone else is going to have to, basically a sovereign state is going to have to decide how much protection is enough protection for their citizens. That's not what ICAO does. All we can do is try to provide a framework under which they can exercise their sovereign decision on how much is enough. That's not up to us. Rob, a quick one?
So really quick, and when you're not familiar with it, please look it up. But one of the guiding principles that we are using under the network management and policies is the use of zero trust network and microsegmentation. And that basically also gives you the additional protection where you can, in fact, assign specific policies to specific risk categories and still keep them segregated.
Okay, I'm up against my time limit, and so I've got a couple questions for DJI, but I think that, so we're basically talking about integrating technology, assist in drone registration is one question, and a similar question talks about point of sale, how is this registration thing going to work? We might be able to just kick that to tomorrow afternoon because I think you're going to see that in real time. And so I think, with your permission, we'll respond to it there with blinking lights and moving certificates and all sorts of cool stuff. And so with that, I think I'm hitting the end of the time. I promise to finish on time. So thank you all, and thank you to the panel. Thank you for the audience participation. Enjoyed it very much.
If you